If someone had told me a year ago that the loudest thing in my life would be the silence of another person's absence, I would have laughed. My life was a carefully curated library of quiet. Each day was a familiar book taken from the shelf, read, and returned in the same pristine condition. I liked it that way. I needed it that way. My cabin, nestled 2 miles down a gravel road, was my fortress against a world that had always felt too loud, too fast, too much. My routine was my armor. Coffee at 6, brewed in a French press. Writing from 7 until noon. Chasing words that often felt just as reclusive as I was. A simple lunch. An afternoon walk through the pines, the only conversation being the rustle of leaves and the caw of a distant raven. I was solitary, but I never consider myself lonely. There's a difference. Solitude is a choice. Loneliness is a failure. And I was not failing. Then came Cole. He bought the old Henderson place, the 10 acres bordering my property to the west. From my writing desk, I had a clear view of his land, a stretch of meadow that rolled down to a creek. He was a disruption from the very first day. The growl of his oversized truck tearing up the gravel. The buzz of a chainsaw where there had only been birdsong. The sharp, percussive bangs of a hammer, each one a stone thrown into the still pond of my quiet. I watched him from a distance, a character I was observing but couldn't quite write. He was physically imposing, a silhouette of broad shoulders and confident strides against the setting sun. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of hard work and physical certainty. He seemed so utterly at home in his own skin, in a way I had never been. He was everything I was not, loud, visceral, unapologetically present in the world. I decided he was arrogant. It was easier that way. It kept the distance clean. He was the antagonistic force, the noisy neighbor who didn't respect the sanctity of the woods. He was a problem to be managed, a variable in my controlled experiment of a life. We never spoke, not really. A stiff nod if we passed on the road, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust that I would have to wait to settle. A raised hand from across the meadow if he caught me on my porch. These were not interactions. They were acknowledgments of mutual existence, nothing more. A social contract signed at 100 yards. I told myself this was enough. More than enough. But I watched. I am an observer by trade and by nature. I saw him wrestle a fallen log with a length of chain, muscles in his back and arms cording with the effort. I saw him stand on his porch at dawn, a mug of what I assumed was coffee steaming in his hand, his face turned towards the rising sun with a stillness that contradicted the noise he usually made. I saw him one evening, after a long day of work, simply sit on his steps and stare out at the same woods I loved, a look of profound weariness on his face. Each observation was a tiny crack in the armor of my judgment. Arrogance didn't look that tired. Confidence didn't seem that lonely. The barrier between us was physical, a creek and a fence line, but the one I was building in my mind was far more formidable. It was made of assumptions and fear. A fear of the disruption he represented. A fear of the strange, unsettling pull I felt whenever I saw him. A low thrum of longing that I refused to name. For months, this was our dynamic. 2 planets in adjacent orbits, held apart by the gravity of our own separate lives. My routine continued, my walls held firm. I wrote, I walked, I kept to myself, and I watched the man next door build his life, hammer by hammer, saw by saw, a life that felt so much more real and tangible than the one I was creating with ink on a page. The distance was safe. The distance was necessary. Then the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The weather report had been talking about it for days. A significant meteorological event, a storm of the decade. I did what I always did. I prepared. I chopped extra wood for the stove, filled jugs with water, checked the batteries in my flashlights. My cabin was small but sturdy, built a century ago to withstand whatever the mountains decided to throw at it. I wasn't worried. I was prepared. Preparation was my answer to chaos. The wind began as a whisper, a nervous shiver in the pines. Then it grew into a moan, then a roar. Rain came down not in sheets, but in solid, wind-driven walls of water. The world outside my windows dissolved into a churning gray chaos. The lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered, plunging the cabin into a dim, stormy twilight. I lit the kerosene lamps, their golden glow a small pocket of defiant calm in the howling gale. I was sitting by the fire, a book open on my lap, pretending to read. But my focus wasn't on the words. It was on the storm. And if I was honest, it was on the house across the meadow. Cole's house was newer, but it was more exposed, sitting on a rise with little tree cover. I imagined him in there alone just as I was. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A deep, splintering crack, followed by a ground-shaking thud that vibrated through the floorboards of my cabin. It was close. Too close. I went to the window, wiping away the condensation, and peered through the deluge. At first, I saw nothing but the thrashing trees. Then a flash of lightning bleached the landscape white, and I saw it. A massive oak, one of the ancient ones from the fence line, had fallen, and it had fallen right across the corner of Cole's roof. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Is he okay? What if he's hurt? For a moment, I was paralyzed. My instinct was to stay inside, to keep the storm out and my safety in. That was the rule. My rule. But the image of that tree, of that crushed roof, broke the rule. Before I could overthink it, before my anxiety could build a prison around me, I was pulling on my boots and my heaviest raincoat. I grabbed a powerful flashlight, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the bees in my stomach, and opened the door. The wind tore the door from my hand, slamming it back against the wall. Rain hit my face like a spray of cold needles. I fought my way down the steps and into the maelstrom, my flashlight beam a fragile sword cutting through the darkness. The 100 yards to his property felt like a mile. Mud sucked at my boots. Wind shoved me sideways. I was halfway across the meadow when I saw a light, bobbing and weaving, coming towards me. It was Cole. He was limping, one hand pressed to the side of his head, but he was moving. Relief washed over me, so intensely my knees went weak. He saw my light and stopped, shielding his eyes. I ran the last few feet, my voice swallowed by the wind. "Cole!" I yelled, the name feeling foreign and strange on my tongue. He lowered his hand. Water was streaming down his face, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. There was a dark gash just above his eyebrow, blood mixing with the rain. "Lau!" His voice was rough, incredulous. He looked from my face to my cabin, then back again. "What are you doing out here?" I saw the tree fall. I thought, "Are you hurt?" "Just a knock." Some plaster came down. He looked back at his wounded house. "The whole damn corner of the roof is gone. It's raining in the kitchen." He swayed slightly, and I reached out instinctively, grabbing his arm to steady him. And that was it. The first touch. His arm was solid muscle under his soaked jacket. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock that traveled up my arm and detonated somewhere in my chest. My mind went completely blank. All the noise of the storm, all my anxieties, all the carefully constructed distance between us, it all vanished. There was only the feeling of his arm in my hand, the rough texture of his jacket, the heat of him. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back to my face. His eyes, dark and unreadable in the storm, held mine for a beat too long. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. "You can't stay there," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy. He just nodded, a slow, weary gesture. He looked utterly spent. The confident, arrogant neighbor was gone. In his place was a man who was hurt, exhausted, and whose house was broken. "Come on," I said, my grip on his arm tightening, a strange possessiveness taking hold. "You can stay with me. Until the storm passes." He didn't argue. He just let me lead him, a large and solid presence limping beside me, back across the flooded meadow and toward the warm, golden light of my cabin. The fortress was breached. The chaos was coming inside. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid. I was terrified. And something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Getting him inside was like maneuvering a ship into a small harbor. He seemed to fill the space, his sheer size and the dripping water and the smell of rain and damp earth a sudden, overwhelming presence in my quiet, ordered world. I closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm's roar, and the silence that fell between us was a physical weight. He stood dripping on the small rug by the door, looking around my cabin with a sort of dazed curiosity. His eyes took in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the worn leather armchair by the fire, the neat stacks of paper on my writing desk. It was like he was seeing the blueprint of my soul, and I felt a sudden, sharp vulnerability. "Sit down," I said, my voice more commanding than I intended. "Let me look at that cut." He moved toward the fireplace and sank onto the hearth, wincing as he moved his leg. I lit another lamp, the room brightening, and for the first time, I saw him clearly, up close. The distance was gone, collapsed into the space of a few feet, and the details were staggering. The cut above his eye was deep, beaded with blood that he kept trying to wipe away. There were faint silver scars cutting through the dark stubble on his jaw, and a small, jagged one on his lower lip that I had never noticed from across a meadow. His hands, resting on his knees, were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who built things, who fought against the physical world for a living. But what struck me most were his eyes. They weren't arrogant. They were exhausted, shadowed with a weariness that seemed bone-deep. The strong, silent type was a facade. I was looking at a man holding himself together with sheer force of will. I went to the bathroom and came back with the first aid kit. My hands felt clumsy and thick as I opened it. "This might sting," I mumbled, dabbing at the gash with an antiseptic wipe. He flinched but didn't pull away. He just watched me, his gaze intense and unervingly direct. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the scent of pine and wet soil clinging to his clothes. My heart was doing a frantic, stumbling rhythm against my ribs. I was too close. My entire system was screaming at the proximity, the invasion of my personal space, but I couldn't move away. "Hold still," I whispered, my fingers brushing his temple as I tried to apply a butterfly bandage. His skin was hot. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his big frame. "Thanks," he rasped, his voice low and rough. I finished my clumsy doctoring and stood up, needing to put some distance between us. "You need to get out of those wet clothes. You'll catch your death." He looked down at his soaked jeans and shirt as if just noticing them. "Yeah, I don't have anything else, of course." He'd run from a collapsing house. I went to my bedroom and pulled out a pair of old soft sweatpants and a thick wool sweater. They would be too short on him, ridiculous probably, but they were warm and dry. I laid them on the armchair. "Here, the bathroom's through there. I'll make some tea." It was a dismissal, a retreat to my routine, to the familiar ritual of boiling water. He stood, and I saw him bite back a groan of pain as he put weight on his leg. "My ankle," he said, by way of explanation. "Twisted it coming down the steps." Here was the moment. The shifting of the ground beneath my feet. He was hurt. He was vulnerable. And he was in my house, in my care. The power dynamic, which had always felt so skewed. Him the capable, physical man, me the quiet, intellectual observer, was suddenly, shockingly level. No, it was more than level. He needed me. "Sit down," I said again, my voice softer this time. "Let me see." He hesitated, then sat on the edge of the armchair. I knelt in front of him, a position that felt both subservient and strangely intimate. I carefully rolled up the leg of his wet jeans. His ankle was already swelling, turning a mottled blue. "That looks bad," I said, my fingers gently probing the swollen flesh. He hissed in a sharp breath. Another jolt. The simple, clinical touch felt anything, but it felt like a transgression, a crossing of a boundary I had spent my entire life fortifying. His skin was warm, the dark hair on his leg rough against my fingertips. I felt a flush creep up my neck. I stood up abruptly. "I'll get you some ice." While he changed in the bathroom, I moved on autopilot, my mind a chaotic whirl. I wrapped ice in a dish towel. I put the kettle on the wood stove. I tried not to think about the fact that Cole, the man from across the meadow, the man who populated my quiet daydreams, was taking off his clothes in my bathroom. My stomach was a nest of live wires. He came out wearing my clothes, and I almost laughed. The sweatpants ended mid-calf, and the sweater was tight across his broad chest and shoulders. He looked like a giant who had stolen a normal-sized person's clothes. But he also looked softer, less intimidating. The wool sweater seemed to absorb some of his hard edges. He saw me looking and gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "Not exactly my size. It's better than pneumonia," I replied, handing him a steaming mug of tea. Our fingers brushed as he took it. A spark. A tiny, insignificant event that felt like a lightning strike in the confines of the cabin. We both pulled our hands back at the same time. He settled into the armchair, the one I was always sitting in, and propped his iced ankle up on a stool. I took the opposite chair, my chair, which suddenly felt like it was in the wrong place. The storm raged outside, a distant, muffled roar now that we were inside. But the real storm was in this room. It was in the charged silence, the stolen glances, the space between our chairs that felt both impossibly wide and terrifyingly small. We sat like that for a long time, drinking our tea, listening to the fire crackle and the wind howl. The carefully constructed world I had built for myself had been invaded, and the invader was sitting in my favorite chair, wearing my clothes, looking at me with an expression I couldn't begin to decipher. And the most terrifying part? I didn't want him to leave. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the guttering of the lamps and the shifting of logs in the fire. The storm showed no signs of letting up. It had settled into a relentless, percussive rhythm against the roof, a constant reminder of our isolation. The world had shrunk to the four walls of my cabin. There was nowhere to go. No one else existed. Just us. We started to talk. It wasn't a floodgate opening, but a slow, hesitant trickle of words into the vast space of our shared silence. I asked him about his house. He told me he'd been building it himself, piece by piece, for the last year. He wasn't a builder by trade. He was a mechanic, but he'd always wanted to build his own place. There was a quiet pride in his voice, now laced with a deep, aching frustration. "A year's worth of weekends," he said, staring into the fire. Gone in a second, I found myself telling him about my writing, something I rarely discuss with anyone. I told him about the novel I was wrestling with, how the characters felt more real to me than most people. He listened. He didn't just wait for his turn to talk. He actually listened, his dark eyes fixed on my face, nodding in all the right places. He asked questions, smart questions. "So you build worlds with words," he said, a thoughtful look on his face. "I just use wood and nails. Guess it's not so different." And just like that, another brick in the wall I'd built between us crumbled to dust. He wasn't just a loud, physical presence. He was thoughtful. He was seeing me. Later, I made a simple dinner of canned soup and toast, heated on the wood stove. We ate sitting by the fire, the plates balanced on our laps. It felt domestic. It felt surreal. The man who had been a distant, intimidating figure was now sharing a meal in my home, his socked foot, wearing a pair of my thick wool socks, propped up near the hearth. The conversation deepened. He talked about moving here to get away from the city, from a life that had become too complicated, too full of ghosts. He didn't elaborate on the ghosts, but I could hear them in the spaces between his words. I understood ghosts. My own were the reason I'd built this fortress in the first place. "It gets lonely, though," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't looking at me, but at the flames. Quieter than I expected, this was the confession. Not a confession of love or desire, but of a shared human frailty. Loneliness. The thing I had renamed solitude to make it feel like a choice. His admission gave me permission to feel my own. "I know what you mean," I said, my own voice quiet. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were wide with a raw, startling vulnerability. The strong, silent facade was completely gone. In its place was just Cole, a man who was lonely and hurt and sitting in a stranger's cabin while a storm tried to tear the world apart. "I used to see you," he said, his voice low and hesitant, "sitting out on your porch, or walking in the woods. You always looked so content, like you had it all figured out." The quiet, my breath caught in my throat. He had been watching me, too. The observer had been observed. "It's just quiet," I managed to say. "It's not the same as content." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything that hadn't been said for months. Full of mistaken assumptions and unspoken curiosity. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. It was a magnetic pull, an invisible string tightening between us. I stood up to take his empty plate, and he reached out, his hand closing around my wrist. His touch was warm and firm. It wasn't accidental this time. It was deliberate. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I stopped, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I looked down at his large, calloused hand wrapped around my wrist. Then I looked up into his eyes, and I saw it. The same longing I had been trying to suppress for months. The same pull. It was right there, raw and undeniable in his gaze. He stood up, wincing as he put a little weight on his bad ankle, but he didn't let go of me. He used my arm to steady himself, pulling me closer until there were only inches between us. He was so tall, I had to tilt my head back to look at him. I could see the flicker of the firelight reflected in his dark eyes. He raised his other hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched my cheek. His thumb stroked my jaw, a touch so tender it made my knees weak. My carefully constructed world was not just breached, it was dissolving. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through me. I couldn't find my voice. I could only nod, a small, jerky movement. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to retreat back into my fortress. But I didn't. I couldn't. I met him halfway. His lips were chapped and soft. The kiss wasn't frantic or passionate. It was a question. It was hesitant and searching and breathtakingly honest. It was the taste of wood smoke and tea in the storm outside. It was a quiet confirmation of everything that had passed between us in the last few hours. The loneliness, the vulnerability, the relief of being seen. I brought my hand up to his chest, feeling the steady, heavy beat of his heart under my palm, a rhythm that seemed to calm the frantic fluttering of my own. He deepened the kiss, a soft groan escaping his throat, and I melted against him, my walls of solitude turning to dust and blowing away in the wind. The morning broke, quiet and unervingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, glittering under a pale sun. The silence from outside seeped into the cabin, a stark contrast to the howling chaos of the night before. But it was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, awkward. I woke up alone in my bed. For a disoriented moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The storm, the fallen tree, Cole, the kiss. But then I saw his borrowed clothes, folded neatly on the armchair where he'd left them. And the empty space beside me in the bed felt less like an absence and more like an accusation. We had eventually moved to my bedroom. It had felt natural, inevitable. We hadn't done much more than kiss, holding each other against the storm, two solitary souls clinging together for warmth and reassurance. I had fallen asleep to the sound of his steady breathing, feeling safer than I had in my entire life. Now, the safety was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The morning after anxiety. It coiled in my stomach, a familiar, sickening serpent of doubt. I got out of bed and pulled on a robe, my movements slow, cautious, as if a sudden move might shatter the fragile hope of the previous night. I walked into the main room. He was standing by the window, already dressed in his own damp clothes, staring out at his damaged house. He didn't turn when I entered. "The storm's over," he said, his voice flat. All the warmth from the night before was gone. It was the voice of the stranger from across the meadow. "Cole," I said, his name a question mark in the quiet room. He finally turned, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at the floor, at his boots, at the wall behind me. Anywhere but at me. I should go. See how bad the damage is. I've got a lot to do. Each word was a small, sharp stone. My heart, which had felt so full and open just hours ago, began to close up again, the old defensive instincts kicking in. "Okay," I said, my own voice carefully neutral. I would not let him see how much this hurt. I would not. He moved towards the door, limping more noticeably now that the adrenaline had worn off. He paused with his hand on the knob. "Thanks," he said, still not looking at me. "For everything, everything." The word was so big and so meaningless. It covered the shelter, the first aid, the food. Did it cover the confession? The kiss? The shared vulnerability in the dark? He said it like he was thanking a polite stranger for giving him directions. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence he left in his wake was deafening. It was a hollow, ringing void where his presence had been. I stood there, motionless, in the middle of my cabin, and felt the walls of my fortress rebuilding themselves around me, stone by painful stone. It was a mistake. Of course it was a mistake. It was the storm, the proximity, the drama of the moment. It wasn't real. He regrets it. He's embarrassed. I misread everything. The litany of self-recrimination began its relentless march through my mind. I was a fool to think a man like him could ever be interested in someone like me. A fool to let my guard down. The next few days were a special kind of hell. My solitude, which had once been a comfort, was now tainted. It was no longer a choice. It was a rejection. The quiet of the cabin no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty. Every creak of the floorboards was a reminder that he was not here. The armchair looked wrong without him in it. The whole cabin felt wrong, like a stage after the play has ended, the ghost of the performance hanging in the air. I tried to return to my routine. I made the coffee. I sat at my desk, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare out the window. I saw him over there, on his property. He had a blue tarp stretched over the hole in his roof. He was clearing the debris from the fallen oak, cutting it up with a chainsaw. The sound, which had once been an annoyance, was now a painful reminder of his presence and his distance. He never looked over. Not once. I watched him for hours, a pathetic vigil from my window, but he kept his back to me, his focus entirely on his work. We were back to being strangers. Worse than strangers. We were two people pretending the most honest night of their lives had never happened. The distance between our houses was only 100 yards, but it felt like 1,000 miles. An uncrossable chasm of unspoken regret. I told myself it was for the best. Life could go back to normal, to the way it was. Safe, quiet, controlled. But it was a lie. The control was gone. He had walked into my fortress and shown me what lay outside the walls, and now I could never unsee it. The quiet was no longer a comfort. It was a constant, screaming reminder of what I had briefly held and immediately lost. I was lonely, and it was a failure. By the third day, I had convinced myself I needed to be the one to fix it. Not to get him back, but to clear the air, to release the tension that was suffocating the very air between our properties. I would walk over there, and I would say something mature and detached. No hard feelings. It was the storm. Let's just forget it. I practiced the words in my head until they tasted like ash. But I never went. My courage failed me every time I reached for the door. The fear of seeing pity or disgust in his eyes was too much to bear. So I stayed inside. I waited, and the silence stretched on, thin and brittle, ready to snap. On the evening of the fourth day, I was sitting on my porch, watching the dusk settle over the trees, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness settle into my bones. I had given up hope. He had made his choice. He had retreated back to his world, and I was left in mine. And then I heard the crunch of boots on the gravel of my path. My head snapped up. It was Cole. He was walking, not toward his own house, but toward mine. He was moving slowly, his limp still pronounced, and he was carrying something in his hands. A cardboard box. My heart started that familiar, frantic pounding. This is it. He's returning my clothes. The final severance. The official end to the thing that never even began. I braced myself. I arranged my face into a mask of cool indifference. He stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, and for the first time in 4 days, he looked at me. Really looked at me. And what I saw in his eyes wasn't pity or disgust. It was the same exhaustion from the night of the storm, but it was coupled with a deep, gut-wrenching uncertainty. He looked just as wrecked as I felt. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "Hey," I replied, my voice tight. He stood there for a long moment, shifting his weight. The silence hummed with tension. "I'm an idiot," he said finally, the words a low rumble. I didn't say anything. I just waited. "I'm sorry," he continued, taking a hesitant step closer, "for just leaving like that, and for the last few days. I panicked. The admission hung in the air between us. Panic, not rejection. Panic. I've never felt like that," he said, gesturing vaguely towards my cabin, towards the memory of that night. With anyone, it scared the hell out of me. I don't know how to do this. This feeling, my carefully constructed mask of indifference began to crack. He was scared. The big, confident man who could wrestle trees and build houses was scared of feeling. Of me. I thought you regretted it. I confessed, my voice barely a whisper. He let out a short, harsh laugh. Regretted it? Leo, it's the only thing I've thought about for 4 days. I thought I was going to mess it up. That I already had. I'm not good with words. Or feelings. I'm good at fixing things. And I didn't know how to fix this. He finally looked down at the box in his hands. My coffee maker was in the part of the kitchen that got ruined. It's full of rain and plaster. He lifted the box a few inches, a small, hopeful gesture. I was wondering if I could maybe keep my coffee here. For a while, it wasn't just about coffee. We both knew it. It was a question. It was an offering. A tangible, symbolic gesture. He wanted to share a space in my life. He wanted to build something new in the wreckage of his old assumptions and my old fears. A slow smile spread across my face, the first genuine smile in days. The tension in my chest eased, the knot of anxiety finally uncoiling. Yeah, I said, my voice thick with relief. Yeah, Cole, you can keep your coffee here. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days and climbed the steps. He didn't stop when he reached the top. He walked right up to me, put the box down on the porch railing, and framed my face with his large, warm hands. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. I won't run again. I was scared too. I admitted, my hands finding their way to his waist, holding on as if to anchor myself. Good, he murmured, a faint smile on his lips. Then we can be scared together. And he kissed me. Not a hesitant, questioning kiss like the one in the storm, but a kiss of fierce, profound relief. It was a promise, a recommitment, a new beginning, right here on the porch of my once impenetrable fortress. The storm had passed, but the man it had brought to my door was here to stay. And so he moved in, not all at once, but in pieces, the way he had built his house. First, it was the coffee maker, which found a permanent home on my kitchen counter. Then it was a toothbrush in a mug by the sink. Then a duffel bag of clothes appeared in my closet, his heavy work boots a startling, masculine presence next to my worn hiking shoes. His house was a long-term project now, a wreck that would take months, maybe a year, to fix properly. He didn't seem to mind. My cabin, once a bastion of solitude, became our shared space. A home. The quiet changed. It was no longer the sterile, empty quiet of my former life. It was a comfortable silence, filled with the sheer presence of another person. It was the soft scratch of his pencil as he sketched out new plans for his roof while I typed at my desk. It was the gentle thud of his boots as he came in from a long day's work. It was the sound of his breathing next to me in the dark. Our routines merged, creating a new, shared rhythm. I would wake up first and make the coffee, his coffee from his machine, and he would wake up to the smell, stumbling out of the bedroom with his hair a mess, a sleepy, grateful smile on his face. He would make us dinner, simple, hearty meals that filled the cabin with the scent of roasted garlic and onions, while I read to him from whatever book I was lost in. We learned each other's landscapes. I learned the map of scars on his body, the story behind each one. He learned the nuances of my moods, could tell from a single glance whether the words were coming easily or fighting me every step of the way. He would place a mug of tea on my desk without a word and then disappear outside, giving me the space he somehow knew I needed. There was an ease to it that I never would have thought possible. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for so long began to recede. Sleeping in the same bed was no longer a source of morning after panic, but a deep, profound comfort. Waking up to find him there, his arm thrown protectively over my waist, his face peaceful in sleep, felt like the most natural thing in the world. One Saturday morning, we were working together in the meadow, clearing the last of the fallen oak. I was hauling smaller branches while he used the chainsaw on the massive trunk. The sun was warm on my back, the air crisp and clean. He cut the engine, and in the sudden silence, I watched him. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand, his bicep flexing with the movement. He caught me looking and grinned, a wide, genuine grin that lit up his whole face. In that moment, I felt a wave of such pure, unadulterated happiness that it almost knocked me off my feet. This was my life now. This loud, capable, gentle man was my life. That night, lying in bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, I turned to him. "Do you ever miss it?" I asked quietly. The way things were before. The quiet. He was quiet for a moment, tracing patterns on my arm with his fingertip. "I thought I wanted quiet," he said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "But I think what I really wanted was peace. And my house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was just empty." He pulled me closer, his lips brushing my temple. "This is peace." I thought about my old life, my fortress of solitude and my armor of routine. I had built it to protect myself from the world, from the risk of getting hurt. But a fortress is also a prison. It keeps things out, but it also keeps you in. Colt wasn't an invader who had breached my defenses. He was the one who had finally given me the key to my own cage. The storm wasn't a disaster that had wrecked our homes. It was the chaotic, beautiful, terrifying event that had saved us both. It had washed away the old foundations and forced us to build something new, something stronger, together. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the unexpected character who walked onto the page and rewrote my entire story. I had come to these woods seeking solitude, a life free of complications and emotional risk. Instead, I found him. I found us. And I realized I hadn't been living before, not really. I had just been waiting for the storm. He never did fix that coffee maker. He didn't need to. He had one here in our kitchen, ready for him every morning. He had asked if he could stay until the storm passed. And then, in the quiet, gentle way that had become our language, he simply never left. And I never wanted him to. Looking back, it's funny how we build walls to keep ourselves safe, only to find that the real safety lies in letting someone tear them down. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the course of your life? A storm that brought something unexpected and wonderful right to your door? Let me know your own stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing how life surprises us. And if you enjoy stories about finding love when you least expect it, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.